The heart monitor didn't just flatline. It screamed, alarm. Merciless tone that sliced through Trauma Bay 2 at Cedar Ridge Regional Hospital like a blade. And for a full 3 seconds no one moved. Not Dr. Nathan Calloway with the scalpel hovering uselessly over the Marine's blood-soaked chest. Not the trembling intern fumbling for the defibrillator pads. Not the respiratory tech whispering, come on, under her breath. No one except the quiet middle-aged nurse in oversized scrubs, who had spent the last 5 months refilling supply carts and being told to stay in her lane. Because when she stepped forward and snapped on a fresh pair of gloves with terrifying precision, she didn't ask for permission. She gave an order. And in that instant the entire emergency department realized they weren't looking at a shy 4 nurse anymore. They were looking at someone who had once operated under mortar fire, and she was about to go to war again. Cedar Ridge wasn't a glamorous hospital, tucked into the outskirts of Denver. It was the kind of regional trauma center where promising careers plateaued and egos quietly calcified, clean but bureaucratic, efficient but uninspired. And that suited Nurse Mara Kincaid just fine, because invisibility had been her goal from the moment she transferred there. At 43, she was deliberately forgettable. Her brown hair always pulled back into a tight, practical bun. Her voice soft, her posture slightly rounded as if apologizing for taking up space. She wore scrubs 1 size too large that concealed the wiry strength beneath them, and she spoke only when spoken to, usually to confirm a dosage or ask whether a patient preferred water or ice chips. And to Dr. Calloway, she was simply Kincaid, the nurse who handled paperwork, the one who restocked O-negative blood without being asked, the one he blamed when the ultrasound machine wasn't charged even if he'd forgotten to plug it in. Himself, Calloway at 36 was ambitious, polished, painfully aware of his own reflection in every glass surface. The son of a hospital board member who believed decisiveness was the same thing as competence, and he had little patience for nurses who overstepped. So when Mara had quietly suggested 3 weeks earlier that a patient's subtle hypotension might indicate internal bleeding, he dismissed her with a tight smile and a sharper tone. "Thank you, nurse, but I went to medical school." And she had nodded, stepped back, and let the attending discover the bleed on his own an hour later, because Mara had learned long ago that noise was wasted energy. On the night the Marine came in, the rain was coming down in cold sheets against the ambulance bay doors, and the red trauma phone rang with mechanical urgency. Sarah Lynn, a bright-eyed new nurse fresh out of school, jumped at the sound, but Mara picked it up before the second ring, her posture straightening almost imperceptibly as she listened. "Copy," she said, her voice shifting from soft to clipped. "Precise. ETA?" She paused, eyes narrowing slightly. "Understood. We'll be ready." And when she hung up, she turned to the room and announced in a tone that cut through the low hum of monitors and chatter. "Multi-vehicle collision on I-70. 1 critical. Male, late 20s, pinned for 30 minutes. Hypotensive, penetrating chest trauma. Possible head injury. Active duty Marine." And Calloway rolled his shoulders as if preparing for a performance rather than a crisis. "Prep trauma 2, he said, snapping on gloves. "Kincaid, you handle documentation." And she inclined her head obediently even as her mind ran through possibilities. Penetrating chest trauma, plus hypotension plus prolonged extrication equaled hemorrhage. Maybe tension pneumothorax. Maybe cardiac involvement. And when the ambulance doors burst open with a hiss of cold air and paramedics wheeled in Corporal Daniel Ruiz, his uniform cut away and soaked crimson, Mara's eyes didn't go to the blood first. They went to his neck, to the subtle distension of the jugular veins, to the asymmetrical rise of his chest, to the faint, distant quality of his heart, sounds beneath the chaos. "BP 80/40. A paramedic shouted. "Pulse 130 and thready. We removed a metal fragment from the vehicle, but there may be residual shrapnel." Calloway leaned in, issuing rapid commands. "Chest tube tray. 2 units O-neg. Intubate if he drops." And Mara stayed back where she'd been told, but she watched the monitor, watched the waveform narrow, watched Ruiz's lips lose color. And when Calloway made the incision for a chest tube, dark blood spilled, but not with the relief of pressure they'd hoped for. The monitor began to stutter, the rhythm dissolving into chaos before collapsing into that terrible flat line. "We lost him," the intern cried. "Start compressions." Calloway barked, but Mara stepped forward. "Stop compressions," she said quietly at first, no one hearing her over the flurry. "Stop compressions," she repeated, louder now, and the force in her voice cut through the room like a snapped cable. Calloway spun toward her, incredulous. "Excuse me?" And she didn't flinch, didn't raise her voice further. She simply stated, "His pericardium is filling with blood. That's not a simple hemothorax. If you keep compressing, you'll rupture what's left of his ventricular wall." There was a beat of stunned silence, Sarah staring at her, as if seeing her for the first time. Calloway's expression shifting from irritation to disbelief. "You're a nurse," he said flatly. "Step back." But Mara was already moving closer to the table, her gaze fixed not on the monitor but on the Marine's chest, on the subtle bulge beneath the sternum that confirmed her suspicion, and when the flatline stretched into a relentless tone that seemed to echo off the tiled walls, something ancient and resolute flickered behind her calm exterior, something that did not belong to a community hospital nurse who changed bedpans and avoided conflict. And she snapped on a fresh pair of gloves with the steady hands of someone who had done this before, in darker places, under louder skies. "You need to open his chest," she said, not loudly, not angrily, simply as fact, and for a moment the entire trauma bay hung suspended. Between protocol and instinct, between ego and experience, between the doctor who believed he was in control and the nurse who knew the war had just begun. The flatline still wailed when Mara Kincaid reached for the scalpel, and even as Dr. Nathan Calloway shouted for security and accused her of losing her mind, she knew there was no time left for permission, because Corporal Daniel Ruiz wasn't dying from an electrical problem. He was dying from pressure, his own blood crushing his heart from the inside. "Stop compressions," she ordered, and this time the force in her voice made the intern freeze mid-push. Calloway stared at her in disbelief. "Step away, nurse," he snapped, but Mara had already made the incision in the fourth intercostal space, a clean, decisive cut that silenced the room in horror. She inserted the retractor, spreading ribs with steady strength, and reached inside the Marine's chest without hesitation, locating the swollen pericardial sac and slicing it open in one swift motion. Dark blood gushed out in a heavy spill, relieving the fatal pressure, and beneath her gloved hand the still heart trembled weakly. "Epinephrine, 1 milligram for push," she commanded, and this time no one argued. Sarah moved automatically, voice shaking as she administered the drug. Mara began manual cardiac massage, squeezing the heart rhythmically, relentlessly, whispering under her breath, "Come on, Marine." And the monitor flickered. One blip, then another, jagged electrical life clawing its way back across the screen. "We have rhythm," someone gasped, disbelief cracking into stunned relief. Mara continued. Compressions until the pulse strengthened, then applied a cross-clamp to the aorta with precision that made Calloway's face drain of color, because he recognized the technique from trauma textbooks he had never dared attempt. "He needs the oar now," she said calmly, already climbing onto the moving gurney to maintain control of the clamp as they rushed down the hallway, leaving a stunned trail of staff in their wake. And in the operating suite, the chief of surgery, Dr. Elena Ward, took one look at the thoracotomy and muttered, "That incision placement is perfect," before focusing on repairing the ventricular laceration that would have killed Ruiz within minutes. 2 hours later, the Marine was alive, critical but stable, and back in the administrative conference room. 2 Department of Defense officials placed a file on the table, silencing Calloway's furious claims of malpractice, because inside that file was not the record of a floor nurse, but of Lieutenant Colonel Margaret Kincaid, former forward surgical team commander in Fallujah, specialist in battlefield thoracotomies under live fire. And the liaison fixed his gaze on her and said quietly, "You were supposed to stay retired, Colonel." And Mara, blood still faintly staining her cuffs, replied in a voice stripped of pretense, "I was, until a Marine started dying in front of me." And in that moment the illusion shattered completely. The shy nurse they had overlooked for months was gone, and in her place stood the combat surgeon who had just reached into a man's chest and pulled him back from death. By dawn, Cedar Ridge was under lockdown, reporters crowding the entrance and federal vehicles lining the curb. But inside the ICU, the only thing that mattered was the steady green rhythm on Corporal Daniel Ruiz's monitor, proof that the heart once cradled in Mara's hand was now beating on its own. The crash had been ruled an attempted hit. Brake lines cut, steering sabotaged, and when two armed men posing as hospital staff tried to breach the ICU before sunrise, they were met not by a timid nurse, but by the same combat-honed precision that had reopened a chest hours earlier, disarmed, neutralized, contained, and as agents secured the floor, the truth about her identity spread quickly through administration. Lieutenant Colonel Margaret Kincaid, former battlefield trauma surgeon, decorated and deliberately vanished. Dr. Calloway's protest dissolved under operative reports confirming that without her intervention Ruiz would have died within minutes. And when the Marine's father, Major General Rafael Ruiz, stood beside his son's bed and quietly told her, "You saved him twice," she felt neither pride nor vindication. Only a familiar weight lifting, the burden of hiding finally too heavy to carry. Later, alone in the locker room, she removed the badge that read Nurse M. Kincaid and set it down gently, understanding that anonymity had been a refuge, not a future. And when administration offered her a permanent surgical post, she didn't hesitate this time. "I'll stay," she said. But when a patient is crashing, titles don't matter. Whoever sees it first speaks. And as she returned to the ICU, Ruiz's eyes fluttered open and he rasped a single word, "Doc." And in that quiet recognition, she found what she'd been avoiding for years. She was never meant to disappear, because when the monitor screams and everyone else freezes, the world still needs the hands willing to reach inside the dark and fight death head-on.